you can tell there's such strong mutual respect both ways, which I think is so great when you think about kind of like a 10-year partnership, or at least something that I personally value a lot when I think about who I want to work with for that long of a time.
Thank you. While the rapport, I think, is great, fantastic, I also appreciate that there are so many like folks who might not have that in like that opportune moment to build it, and like I think that's one area where I think within the venture world there's an opportunity to be receptive. And I think that's really cool how Initialize does that, and we'll work with founders who might not necessarily have that relationship with the investors. And I think it's utmost importance because there are plenty of brilliant ideas out there that are waiting to be seeded. So.
Yeah, I think for us at Initialize, we have made investments when people have reached out cold, right? Brett, has made that type of investment. Brett, my partner, who also, supports Kaliza. And so I think, there's nuance to every single type of like investment and partnership that we make. There are times where we're investing in people who we've known for a long time, and it allows you to kind of see, the line instead of just like one point in time. And then just recently we made an investment in a founder who we'd never met before, but we clicked, and I think we had a lot of alignment, and so it's fairly idiosyncratic, and we're open to both approaches.
Welcome to Inside the Deal, the podcast where we explore how funding rounds come to fruition from start to close. I'm Adam Hardy from Sandhill Markets.
And I'm Steph Moy from PIN. Our head of growth, Daniel Wiegand, and I are teaming up to host this podcast with Sandhill Markets. Together, we sit down and discuss the intricacies of how venture funding rounds come together.
Tune in to hear how investments are formalized from both the founder and investor perspectives, from initial conversations to final close.
Whether you're an investor or founder curious about the fundraising process, please enjoy the episode.
Welcome to another episode of the Inside the Deal podcast. Today, I'm joined by my co-host, Steph Moy, who is the founder and CEO of PIN, as well as Abdul Lee, who is a partner at Initialize Capital, and Ezra Kabrab, who is founder and CEO of Kaliza. Thank you guys all so much for being here and taking the time. Really excited.
Hello.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome. Thanks.
Awesome. So Ezra, let's start with you. Would love to hear a little bit more about yourself, your background, and what it is you guys are building with Kaliza.
Yeah, sure. Also, love that you pronounced the name correctly. Quick background on myself and Kaliza. Family's Ethiopian Eritrean, but I was born and raised in D.C. myself, Washington, D.C. Went to school in New York, lived in the Bay Area where I got to cut my teeth and a lot of the exposure to fintech and payments over the last decade. I worked with 4 other folks to build a peer-to-peer payment startup about 10 years ago that eventually Square picked up, and then spent the last 3 years before Kaliza at Visa before starting this company. And so Kaliza's goal or mission really is to provide bank settlement across different markets like Brazil, US, Mexico, Asia for trade purposes. So think of any exporter or importer that normally is relegated to using Swift wires could essentially use their local payment rail system and have the accessibility of an instant cross-border transfer. So that in dollar accounts is kind of the simplest way to boil it down.
Awesome. And Abdul, same question to you. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background and what it is you guys look for at Initialize.
For sure. So I'm Abdul Lee from Senegal, and I'm a partner here at Initialize. So the quick background on Initialize is we're a VC firm that invests in seed stage companies. And so a few examples are Coinbase, Instacart, Fly.io, Rippling, and many, many more to come, just such as PIN and Kaliza. And what we try to do is just look for exceptional founders who are on the edge, and our role is to kind of cut all the noise around them. So it's a pretty lean team of folks that I'm really excited to work with, and that's the background on me.
Fantastic. So before we get into your guys' relationship between Kaliza and Initialize, Ezra, would love to hear a little bit more. So you've been in the payment space, with your experience in Visa. I think I even saw some tweets dating all the way back to 2016 about instant payments. And curious from your experience, what were some of the things that were missing, or some of those larger companies just weren't able to execute on that really drove you to jumping in and starting Kaliza?
It's a good question. I think ultimately, it was interesting. When we started Kaliza, there was, we've now seen kind of an interesting cycle of crypto, right? I think there was the early heyday of a lot of interest around, I come across with maybe some strong stances or takes, but I think there was a lot of interest in speculative trading and among other use cases. And I have, for better or worse, like the naivete of someone who's really focused on the lens of payments. And there were several ways that certain protocols were trying to solve this, but where I was most obsessed was with stablecoins. And at that time, you had this spectrum of like traditional financial institutions that did not want to touch it. That was like brand new. They were afraid. It was almost like treated as if like it was a remote disease, like not to be meddled with. And then there was the other end of the spectrum, which was like we're going to totally circumvent the incumbents in the existing like banking system altogether. And so in my mind, there was like some healthy middle ground of, well, there's some of this technology that could be readily accessible, and a few players were really like paying attention to that at the time. I think a lot has changed. There's been a lot of excitement and interest in stablecoins recently, which I think is great for the industry. It's great as regulators start to think more about it, as banks start to think more about it as well. But there just really was like few players right at that time, right, that were looking at how do we use stablecoins as a cross-border payment mechanism.
I'm actually curious. People talk about in consumer all the time, like how hard it is to make people change, like if they're stubbornly thinking and feeling a certain way. So I'm kind of curious how much of your guys' path in establishing, or getting people who formerly kind of, were scared of this space to adopt you guys, how much of it was your guys' doing, design, and educating them through your product or go to market versus kind of like macro trends that were also kind of helping you? I'm sure there was maybe some combination of the two, but curious how you think about that.
100% a combination. It's a great point. And even the way we talk about it, right, really depends on the audience. So, for example, I remember when I was first pitching what we were building, the moment a word stablecoin came out of my mouth, or I even said crypto, people's minds like jumped to Bitcoin. And I was like, we don't touch Bitcoin. We don't touch Bitcoin.
I think I was guilty of that as well. Yeah, initially.
I don't think I'm doing, I won't call you out on that, but I think there were several others I remember talking to, and I was like, where did that word enter their brain? I never said it. I never uttered it. But it's interesting how a lot of folks align that. And so you even start to notice the industry adopted like new vocabulary around stablecoins. Like you start hearing tokenized assets referring to like the whole spectrum, not just like currencies, but other items like gold, right, for that matter. Or digital assets being the go-to term now over cryptocurrencies, which many banks now use, right? It's almost like a reformed term, if you will. So part of it is the macroeconomic like tailwinds, and I think banks realize that there's some real use case here. Many are just trying to find out ways to experiment or dabble in the space. Part of it's also just us needing to educate, right? And we're lucky that we have good partners, right, that have been doing a lot of the heavy lifting as well. Like we rely on stablecoins like Circle's USDC, among others, and they have a monthly attestation by a third party. I believe it was Deloitte. I'm now forgetting, but one of these third parties that essentially will share an audit report on the underlying assets, right? And so showing to people that there's real money or real assets underneath each of these tokens and reserves was a core part of what we had to share. That like we're not trying to create something net new per se, right, from a currency standpoint. That was where a lot of the education came from. Otherwise, it was a mix of kind of like macroeconomic tailwinds as well.
And so I want to talk about how you guys got in touch. Was it cold reach out? Was it a warm intro? How did that first meeting come to be?
Oh, that's a good. Should I take this one, or I'm doing?
Up to you guys.
How different are the stories?
Yeah, let's see how different the stories are. I mean, so I've actually known Ezra for quite some time. We both met in SF in our early 20s. Initially socially, but then over time, we spoke a lot about things that we were excited about, namely, fintech and, distributing economic opportunity for folks. And I think the thing that really struck out to me, over all those years is, I guess he's an engineer by training, a historian at heart, and a curator by trade. And the reason I say this is because, you might get cornered by Ezra at some point, talking to you about how, salt and cowrie shells were used as like a means of payment in like medieval trade routes. And so, he really cares about the history behind like why things were built a certain way. I think as an engineer, he also has an understanding of the trade-offs that went into it. But he's not afraid to kind of like break with history and build something new. And I think that's something that I really respected when I first heard about the way that he was approaching stable coins and how different it was. And so we had a pre-existing relationship and had gotten to know each other for some time.
I'm only smirking because at the beginning of that story, you share how we met in our early 20s, and it sounded so distant. Like,
I can relate. Yeah.
Father time.
And what's interesting is like in those times, I think I was obsessed. I remember at one point Abdul called me out because I had a book on my shelf called Salt, and it talks about the role of salt historically. And like to this point, I think historical context is so important in any industry you work in. It's very easy to want to disregard it, but whatever space you're trying to crack into, it's important to understand like why things are broken, why things are set up the way they are. Why the U.S., for example, has 12,000 banks or credit unions versus every other country in the world has 5 to 7 banks that have like 90% market share, right? Whether you go to Canada, where there's 5 banks, all with towers right next to each other, or South Korea and Seoul, or whether you go into Mexico, like at the end of the day, almost every country shares this in common except the U.S. And like this is a quick tangent, but the U.S., the reason why we have like thousands upon thousands of like small banks and credit unions is because of the Great Depression. And there's like a whole suite of like policies that the federal government passed to protect these smaller banks, because the thought was they would help uplift smaller businesses. There might not be economies of scale for a lot of them to grow at the same pace of like Chase or Bank of America. And they also eventually in the 70s passed policy that said we're going to cap like at how big a big bank can get inorganically, meaning through M&A. And so like the last example here is like when Bank of America bought Merrill Lynch in 2008 during the financial crisis, it was a big deal because they technically passed that threshold of 10% of ownership of checking accounts. So like the top 3 banks in the U.S. have like 30% market share, so right, roughly of checking accounts. But it all goes back to historical policy. So the thing Abdul didn't mention though is that I remember I had all these various like anecdotes and examples, and he's like, "Well, have you heard of M-Pesa?" And like I had not at the time, and it completely changed my framework about thinking about payments. Like, and the whole interesting thing about M-Pesa is like it's a complete flip of incentive structure for how payments happen between a merchant and an individual. Where if you think about the card network's idea is that the merchant always foots the bill of receiving a payment. In M-Pesa, like it's the idea of like in the global south, or particularly in Kenya, how do you enable trust within a digital payment system when cash is always king? And the sender is actually the one who's paying the fee, right, every time, whether they're sending it to another consumer or merchant or whomever. And it's a whole different like worldview, which I thought was interesting. So sorry for the tangent, massive tangent on payments.
No, it's interesting. So it sounds like it was not a traditional like cold reach out, let me pitch you. Did that alter sort of like your strategy as far as like how that first conversation went? I'm assuming it was probably more conversational, or maybe not, just given your guys' relationship.
Yeah, and maybe we have different perspectives on this, but my perspective is that I've heard various like takes on how to approach investors, how to talk to investors, and many investors and founders might tell you different things, to be quite blunt, right, on the approach. And I think in general, like with anyone that I'm going to do business with, or in whatever capacity, right, whether they're working on the team at Kaliza, whether they're investor, whomever, I would like to have some form of rapport so I get to know who they are as a person, but also like, we might not necessarily align on like cultural values. That's not what I'm necessarily looking for. But how do we think about like how the future of the business and what are the opportunities ahead, and whether there's alignment around that person? And will this be a person that challenges me, right? And is open to doing so, but also supports me and is helpful. And so I don't think you can learn that in a 30-minute Zoom call. And that's why I think it's critical to like get to know an investor prior, assuming you've had the opportunity to do so. So I think we were very fortunate that we had a lot of that rapport. I knew where like Abdul would push me and challenge me. And sometimes I did it, right? And it was a pleasant surprise. But I think it did maybe like change the tone in such that we get straight into like, what is the opportunity for Kaliza? What are the challenges we'll have to overcome? That Abdul pushed me on from the outset.
Yeah, I think for us at Initialize, we have made investments when people have reached out cold, right? Brett, has made that type of investment. Brett, my partner, who also, supports Kaliza. And So I think each there's nuance to every single type of like investment and partnership that we make. There are times where we're investing in people who we've known for a long time, and it allows you to kind of see the line instead of just like one point in time. And then just recently we made an investment in a founder who we'd never met before, but we clicked, and I think we had a lot of alignment, and so it's fairly idiosyncratic, and we're open to both approaches.
Something that stood out immediately, even just in the way that you guys talked about how you guys met and developed your early friendship, is like you can tell there's such strong mutual respect both ways, which I think is so great when you think about kind of like a 10-year partnership, or at least something that I personally value a lot when I think about who I want to work with for that long of a time. So anyway, I think that's really neat that you guys have such a long history there. Very cool.
Thank you. While the rapport I think is great, fantastic, I also appreciate that there are so many like folks who might not have that in like that opportune moment to build it, and like I think that's one area where I think within the venture world there's an opportunity to be receptive. And I think that's really cool how Initialize does that, and we'll work with founders who might not necessarily have that relationship with the investors. And I think it's of utmost importance because there are plenty of brilliant ideas out there that are waiting to be seeded.
So going off that point, Abdul, I'm sure you've seen, over the years, a ton of people trying to solve this problem of cross-border instant payments. What was it about Ezra, the side of the prior relationship, that really made you guys go across the finish line in investing in Kaliza?
I guess there were really two things that drew us here. From the Initialize context, I think my partner Brett has been at the forefront of like decentralized finance and infrastructure, right? He invested in Bison Trails, which is now Coinbase Cloud. Gary previously was the early investor in Coinbase. There are also other companies like Talos and TRM Labs. And so I think having him as a thought partner was invaluable because he brought a very specific point of view, a very specific network. And I think together we kind of like, we're working together to bridge the gap between decentralized finance and more traditional finance, which is kind of, more my world. And so I think that was one thing, right? If Initialize hadn't had that perspective and had to take that risk 10 years ago, maybe the conversation would have been different. But the second part is really just personal experience, to be honest. I guess for background, I grew up in Senegal in West Africa. And when I was really, really young, I remember distinctly my older brother, we would go on walks around the neighborhood. He'd take me to the store and say, hey, guess how much that snack or that drink used to cost just last year? And basically what he was trying to teach me was that our currency had devaluated by 50% overnight. And so that means that people lost assets, their purchasing power was eroded, and it was a really, really tough time. And so that was like the first nugget of like, this world. The second one came when I spent about 6 months living in Brazil, which is one of the markets Kaliza is active in. And in college, essentially, I studied abroad, but I made my plan, my budget from the financial aid office probably a year before I actually went to Brazil. And by the time I got there, the dollar had depreciated against the real. And so there were bigger issues around how that made Brazilian exports more expensive. And that had its own issues. But for me, as a student, thankfully I was able to pay tuition and rent, but it meant, there were a lot of like Nutella sandwiches. And then finally, I think the thing that really brought it all together, and I remember about 2 years ago, I sent a payment, a significant amount of my savings home via, Swift. And, I went with one of the largest established banks, and they were using, an intermediary that's one of the biggest global banks. And my money got lost for 3 months, and no one could tell me where it was. I tried to escalate all the way up. They had no idea. And that's when I really started digging into, the Swift network and why it's kind of like, the money and then the message attached to the money are kind of asynchronous. And some of the operational issues that creates for folks. And so I don't think my story is unique. Many people, many businesses are not only, facing this anxiety of like, where's my money? When is it going to come? But also paying a lot of fees that are hidden through, exchange rates, through, the cuts that all the correspondent banks take. And so that was the time where I'd always been interested in like DeFi. And that was the time where I realized that, there had been some shifts in the financial services that kind of allowed for a rebundling and a building new technology that had actual utility.
Abdul chose the most expensive time to be in Brazil. I'm just now reflecting on that. The exchange rate when you were here was probably like 1 to 2. Now it's like 1 to 5, 4 or so. But like
It was tough, and I saw my colleagues, my classmates who were coming from Europe. They had the euro, and they were going on all these trips. They had a strong currency. It was a humbling time.
I was going to ask, so I guess from your perspective, Abdul, if any, what were the hesitancies that you guys may have had in investing in Kaliza, and what was Ezra able to do to sort of dispel those hesitancies and get you across the line?
For sure. So I guess the context is, we met with Ezra twice. Ezra was initially raising a smaller round, and we, at the time, unfortunately didn't participate because we just were a little bit unclear on how to think about the regulatory side of things. And this was, I think, also at an early stage. But he came back, 6 months later, and he did exactly what he said he was going to do and more, right? He took the hard route of embracing regulatory complexity, working with central banks, integrating into their infrastructure, getting a sponsor bank, and applying for licenses that allowed Kaliza to own their own destiny in the future, as opposed to relying on these intermediaries that are volatile. And I think that was very, very impressive to just kind of go full stack in that way. He, I think, moved to Brazil, learned Portuguese from scratch, started, getting customers.
Oh my gosh. In 6 months? What the? What?
A lot of people think that they can parachute in, and that doesn't work. You have to build real relationships and understanding. And so I think that was extremely impressive. And he got a customer and had volume going through, right? And so that was one thing. And then what else did we do? I think we did some work on the regulatory front. We had a founder who had pursued a similar regulatory path. We spoke to, Circle, Bitso, people who are in trade in Mexico and the US. And I think this is, a perspective and a point of view that we've been developing for a long time and just waiting for the right opportunity to jump. And, thankfully, Kaliza was that.
I love that because I think it's very underrated, or I think founders underestimate the importance of a firm having a point of view on what they're doing. And sometimes I've been, guilty of this as well, like taking things very personally. Like, I feel like I appreciate your kind of candor too about how your guys' internal thesis on the space and your comfort level, et cetera, changed over time. Do the work that you've done or kind of your experience with the founder in the portfolio, et cetera. I just think that's an underrated part of the diligence piece that founders don't really see usually from their individual relationship with the investor. So I think it's super interesting.
I couldn't agree more, Steph. I think it's important to ask that like early on too in the process. It's something I've learned. It's like if for example you are firmly in like call it the fintech or crypto space, it is very important to ask and be inquisitive and understand like what is their position. Like I've definitely pitched investors like I'm never going to invest in this space, but I wanted to spend the time to learn more about it, right? And it's helpful to know if they're forming an opinion or if they're building that process out. So whether you're educating or you're perhaps even having more of a discussion, right, on the topic at hand. To Abdul's credit, Initialized credit, I'm glad we had that first pitch because we had some takeaways and learnings on like how we'd even quantify the process of like the license approach, right, and where we were in that process. Because I think the first time around, you don't really think normally of how do you quantify a process like that. That could be sometimes not necessarily opaque, but like not usually measurable, right? And putting this in a new lens and sharing why it might seem antithetical to kind of like the typical venture cycle, but is like critical to our business or other businesses in highly regulated spaces was a challenge that we had to take on. So I appreciate that feedback from the first encounter we had, right? That led to the successful raise, I guess, this year.
I think another thing that really helped is actually I had the opportunity to meet some folks on Ezra's team as well, right? Oftentimes when you're investing, a CEO is showing up on a pitch meeting, maybe there's a co-founder, but you gain so much texture by spending time with the team, right? Who are ultimately, close to the metal as well and critical component of building this business. And I think I was down in Mexico City and I got to meet Willie, who's brilliant. I'd met Chirag as well, who had done some excellent work at Upstart, right? Like legal background, but someone who still kind of leans into risk, which is a very rare archetype to find, and who's creative. Similar things with Sam on the team as well. And I think by the time they came out to raise, even when you look at their data room and documents, I still kind of use that as a reference because I'd never seen that type of orientation towards detail, and I thought it was extremely impressive. And so I think I got lucky to kind of get exposure to that over time as well.
I appreciate that. Sam and Chirag are very thorough, very, very thorough. I can't take credit for that, but no, the team he's mentioning, I'm very fortunate. I have very detailed, oriented individuals with Willie, Marcus as well, and kind of putting that together, and that helped a lot. So I'm a big proponent of team getting in front of investors when the opportunity arises, for sure.
Yeah, and it just shows the importance of building those relationships. And kind of, Steph, to your point as a founder of, a no now doesn't necessarily mean a no never. And so it's really important to keep those relationships alive, do what you're going to say, and, hopefully things will turn out in a positive manner for, next rounds or whatever ends up happening there. Ezra, so I pulled this from Crunchbase, so if this isn't accurate, let me know. But you raised a round in 2021 and then a new round in 2024. Is that correct?
That is right.
Okay, cool. Sweet.
I'm glad you asked because the past might not have been it. So no, we I think made sure that was updated recently. So
yeah. So curious, did your fundraising process or strategy change across those rounds given just the time in between? And was it more focused on traction versus, that first pitch is usually like pitching the story, the team? Curious of any insights there in the differences between those two rounds.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because 2021 was a year unlike any other year, I think, in the venture world, right? I think I had seen a lot of things happen, but put in perspective, it was just me at the time, right? Pitching on this concept that I had thoroughly vetted and had done tons of conversations with customer prospects, qualified among others. But it was a wholly different positioning when it's just you pitching versus you now have a team, you now have traction, you have to point to that traction over a certain period of time. The narrative is hopefully still similar, but it's more evolved at that point. And so that's part of why, as Abdul mentioned, we had an extensive data room, right, where we had to point to launch dates, regulatory timelines, customer traction, partners, even the evolution of the space in that time, right? As I mentioned, crypto kind of went through a boom and then a winter, and then and how we've tried to remain kind of if you will, constant in that period of time. I think it was a wholly different process. So I don't know if I answered your question directly, but all to say that it was dramatically different. We're pointing more historical context. What we still think is future facing, right, in this last round this year. Whereas in the first round, there's no historical context to point to, where you're really pointing to the upside and painting a vision, right, in your first round. I think that's kind of the night and day difference.
I would love to actually ask more about that because most of my fundraising experience personally, and then having been on the VC side of things, I'm evaluating consumer facing products that, you're looking at the product or you're looking at maybe some early traction. In your space, it must be extremely different just because the barrier to get even any of that traction or product together is so high. Besides the vision, is there anything else that you feel like you did really well in that first pitch to raise a $5 million round by yourself, which is not an easy feat, without being able to show a lot for it?
Fair point. I had maybe I'm underselling this, but I talked to hundreds of people before that pitch, I guess, if you were that fundraise process. When I say hundreds of people, not investors, hundreds of conversations to vet the customer opportunity across Brazil, Mexico, in person, Zoom calls, across various markets to even discern which markets to focus on first. Talk to law firms to understand more of the local regulatory policy. I had gathered as much data as possible. Talked to many former colleagues at Visa. I talked to anyone I could talk to. and was probably doing this for, like, without exaggeration, 12 hours a day for like months. It was a little taxing.
Sounds exhausting. Yeah.
It was actually very taxing. I'll be honest.
I had no idea.
Like I had spent so much time talking to a lot of people, and it's interesting because you're going to get some validation where you're going to have some false yeses. You have to figure out how to cut through that noise. Actually, and this is another interesting nuance. It's like culturally, U.S., Mexico, Brazil, very different, right? I think we're quick to get to know in the U.S. That's less so the case in like I'd say a lot of Latam, but I'm not going to generalize across the whole region, but at least in Brazil and Mexico. And so you have to ask certain questions and kind of push a little more to understand, are people actually genuinely interested in this, or are they just saying so to encourage you, right? And getting that level of like certainty was challenging and required like sometimes 3 calls with the same founder, right? The same Mexican neobank or this supplier. So a lot of that work definitely happened before the first fundraise. And then I think after the first fundraise, then we actually had beyond conversations, like actual like sales funnels to like point 2, right? As things evolved.
So my question is, so after your guys' first meeting with Initialized, what were your feelings after that meeting? Did they give you any indication of, this is something we're super interested in? Did they schedule a follow-on immediately? Just so curious how all of these different conversations go. And I know all firms sort of have their own processes. So curious about how you felt after that first meeting. I know you guys had a long relationship, but.
Regardless of the relationship, I think the emotions still run high for the founder.
Yeah.
I was just texting another founder friend about this earlier today, who was asking about a process they're involved in, and I think whether things are going remarkably well or not, or even you're not certain, right in the middle, the anxiety can be a bit high, right? And I think it's just very important to remain calm, and maybe that's like probably the biggest learning, like of being a founder, is like things will always be volatile, right? I think even when things are going really well, you just have to be prepared for anything that might happen. And I'm not saying that you become unfazed after all, but you start to become a little more desensitized. And so to that end, like I think things look promising with Initialize, but at the same time, I guess after all the exciting ups and challenges, right, or downs like of building as a founder, I was more just like I don't know what's the word I'm looking for here. There was positive indication from Initialize, and so I think things were looking in the right direction. I was very excited about that, but also like not wanting to count my chickens before they hatch, right? And wanted to see how the due diligence process like proceeded. Yeah, I'm curious on Abdul's perspective here, but like to maybe put this on him. But in my shoes, it looked like things were trending well, but not till you really sign a term sheet do I usually want to say that the deal is closed. I think so much could happen between first conversation and that.
Yeah, definitely. I think for us, there's always this balance, right, where you're developing conviction, and leadership at Initialize is comprised by former founders, right? And so it's always better to get to a quick yes or a quick no, right? And so that's something that we're trying to balance, is being very mindful of the founder's time, not wasting their time, not asking them for resources unnecessarily, while also kind of engaging, right? Engaging and doing thorough work and making sure that, like, essentially, the investor is going to know is going to do the most research right before making an investment, not afterwards. And so we also want to be very convicted and make sure that we have a strong point of view. And so there's always that balance. And so, what we try to do is give founders indications of where we are in the process along the way, and also not to overpromise, right? We make decisions as a team. It's not necessarily a consensus-based decision-making process. We do, encourage essentially like divergent point of views. And so I think it's, when you go into a partner meeting, you want to make sure that everyone has, the context that they need, that, all the questions that they may have been answered, and that they can, exit that meeting with a strong point of view. And so, thankfully it worked out, but there are many cases where, an investor might be really excited about what you're working on, but for one reason or another, it really has nothing to do with the founder, even though as a founder, it's personal and it's a, you take it as an indictment on you. Sometimes there are things related to scar tissue, right, that a firm might have, and maybe a lack of neuroplasticity around figuring out, okay, so what has changed? What's different today, right? This doesn't need to be a fixed opinion, right? Like, what has changed today, and should we reevaluate this assumption? And sometimes folks are thinking about all sorts of things, but ultimately, I think we just try to not get in our way. And when you have, incredible founders on the edge trying to build something new, just go ahead and make that investment. And we're also relatively concentrated. For a seed fund, we only make a handful of investments each per year. And so our approach is way less around scouring the earth and trying to find every last company, because unfortunately there are way more great founders and there's capital to be allocated to them. And it's more around kind of like expressing a point of view on the future that you want to exist, and kind of putting some money, resources, and time behind that.
I think the only other thing I want to add is like, Abdul mentioned some points of like how there might be excitement around a founder or a deal, but so many things could happen in that process. I learned so much while building this company about what goes into the process. And I think a lot of founders are not always aware of how every firm is different, right, in their thesis, but most have some similarities, whether it's the decision making that happens on the Tuesday IC or investor committee meeting and whatnot. And so it's not necessarily just because the individual you're acting with, or even individuals, maybe you're talking to three folks at a firm might be excited. Every firm is different, whether it's a vote process, total consensus, and also responding to previous investments, as Abdul mentioned, that may or may not have panned out in a similar group, right? So knowing all of that context, or having as much of that info, I think is helpful as well, as you want to discern what is their likelihood of moving forward.
Yeah, I would say also from personal experience, having pitched you guys too, compared to other firms that I pitched, or even I'll say, NEA also, it was there. I feel like I actually loved this. I felt like the people on your team are more emotive in a very, everyone's supportive, but they're more emotive than the average investor. There are so many other meetings that I would leave and there'd just be deadpan, straight kind of unemotive faces across the board. And you leave the meeting and you're like, did that go well? Did that not go well? I literally have no idea. I feel like the Initialized team, even in questions that are a little bit harder, you can kind of tell who has more questions or doubts about your company than maybe others. But it was obviously said in a really supportive way, in a very positive way. Everyone's very kind. But I appreciated that. I felt like it was more of a conversation rather than a one-way presentation. So I give you guys credit for that.
Oh, yeah, I think there's also something to be said too. Abdul, you touched on it earlier. You've experienced these pain points yourself, and partnering with a founder who's solving a personal pain point for you and many others that I feel like only makes that decision a little bit easier to make. Curious how you guys both thought about this round as a whole. Abdul, on your end, how does it work with Initialize? Is it a standard check size, or how do you think about, leaving space for strategics? Would love to hear actually both of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, maybe I'll get started. So I'd say we generally focus more on ownership, right? But generally we'll invest anywhere between 2 to 4 million into rounds, targeting 10 to 15% ownership. We are definitely collaborative, especially with folks who are strategic. And who might add very differentiated value. And I think Ezra has done a fantastic job of getting the right people around Kaliza. And so I think it's a little bit case by case. Everything is so idiosyncratic. But overall, I think we try to keep our fund model relatively consistent. And then, we're in the business of investing in outliers. And so we try not to get not to let deal terms and those sorts of things get in the way of partnering with someone who can be exceptional. But overall, I'd say $2 to $4 million checks and 10 to 15% ownership.
Yeah, and knowing this, right, is helpful, as I was mentioning, going into the raise. I think something I was naive to before starting this company was that every fund has different ownership targets that can really dictate how a round goes. also different like investment allocations, etc. And to that end, we knew that we wanted to raise funds to expand our operations in Mexico. We actually just spent the last 3 weeks in Mexico City as we're launching there. Very, very exciting stuff, but also to grow more broadly with the acceptance of our licenses, to be able to expand our operations, be more autonomous versus relying on certain partners, also to increase our flows of other markets like parts of Southeast Asia, between LATAM. There was a lot of work cut out for us, and so we initially set out to raise a couple million or so, and like we were very fortunate that ended up being a bit larger than we anticipated, but got some of the what I consider the best players together. Very fortunate to have Initialize, and I was actually joking with one of our angel investors about this, who came on the round. He was founding CFO at Nubank, and we actually just had an article that came out here in Brazil about the launch in Mexico, and it says it actually, I'll be rather honest. It doesn't say Kaliza in the tagline. It actually says founding CFO invested this company spending. And so he emailed me. He's like, I think they got their AI wrong here around this. And so I was laughing. I was like, well, whatever gets eyeballs, right? It gets people excited about what we're building here. But we were fortunate to get and I appreciate Initialize for being open to this, right? Some very supportive angels who have operated here in Brazil and Mexico, that have navigated some of the challenges that I've been through, we'll probably run into, right, in our team for that matter. And I think that's important, is obviously to work with a good fund, but have other collaborators, particularly angels, that have been in your shoes and can help you avoid repeating the same mistakes as that.
Actually, Ezra, I'm curious about digging into that process more, like how you personally ran the process, balancing institutional capital and then angels. I feel like it's a question that I get asked a lot from folks too, like different schools of thought, get angels who are high signal, who can actually help you get great institutions. On the other hand, angels sometimes want a great institutional lead, so they know what the terms are, et cetera. So I'm curious, one, who were kind of the strategic folks, not literally, but I guess who were the kind of folks that you wanted on your cap table? And then kind of second, how did you think about the sequence and process of getting everyone on board?
It's a good question. I think it was very different this year versus that first round. That first round, I went to the angels first. And actually, I appreciate the good advice of an investor on this call, right, for encouraging that. And I think I was frankly skeptical, right? I didn't understand the process. And he was it really boiled down to how angels can be extremely helpful. And the reason they're extremely helpful is because regardless if they're a ridiculously wealthy individual, they are personally cutting a check from their own funds because they believe in you, or they like you, or they believe in what you're building. And you should be shameless in asking for help, right? And many times they can point you, or they're a good indicator, as you mentioned, right, to get you in front of a good fund to support you. And funds often will have a certain subset of angels or operators that they're very keen to get the opinion of, because these are subject matter experts, right? Or they've walked in these shoes before. This round, I'd focus more on, I'd say, the right fund to work with. And in parallel, some of our existing angels said, you got to talk to or meet this person, right? And so I was very fortunate that a lot of it was a bit more organic. There was actually one angel in particular who was super helpful. And funny enough, our good investors at BTV, Jacob, put me in touch with this individual. And next thing you know, he's like, Ezra, you got to meet the founder of MS Online, largest remittance startup in Brazil. You got to meet the founding CEO. And so this person, maybe to be candid, maybe less of the recognizable brand in the US, right, of the Nubank or so, but is an all-star. We get lunch regularly and puts me in touch with great customer prospects. And so that's the other things. I think folks sometimes will pay attention just to the brand and something that's recognizable. And that doesn't mean anything sometimes. Sometimes you really want just an individual who cares a lot about what you're building and will move mountains, right, to make things work. And so big shout out to that individual who was very helpful, Lucas Lima, to Kaliza.
And going off of that, we're seeing a ton of talk these days about value add on top of just the capital. And I think a lot of founders don't really take I don't want to say the word advantage of it as much as they should, but Abdul, from your experience, what is the best way for founders to, I guess, leverage their investors in your experience to gain that help, or whatever value add that is?
I think our point of view at Initialize is like, the founder is the person, is the boss. Like the investors are not the boss. They're not here to be prescriptive, and they're not here to waste your time. And I think the way that I would kind of like summarize it is, we're here to be your peripheral vision, right? As a founder, you're on the field. You sometimes have to move from tunnel vision to, looking at all these different opportunities that are coming your way. Some of it is advice from people. Some of it is, opportunities that, look promising but end up being mirages. And so what our role is to kind of like take all of that noise and kind of like strip it away and just equip you with like, high signal, resources that can help you get to where you need to get faster, right? So it's all about focus. So what does that mean? I think there are the things that we can talk about, such as, we help you with marketing and PR and hiring. But in this specific case, as it relates to Kaliza, I think, internally we have a software system called Folio, which Brad Gibson has built, and it's essentially the repository of everything we've learned, every single interaction we've had with companies over the last 10 years. And so, when Ezra is interested in figuring out, how should I structure this channel partnership? We can say, hey, this company worked on this 2 years ago. Here's a reference point, right? Like, you can use your own judgment about what you want to use and what you don't want to use. Or when he's thinking about structuring a big contract, same thing. We work with later stage companies who have kind of gone through this very recently, and I can kind of share general guidance. But even all the way to, I think, like, the thing that makes me very excited about venture and trying to improve on the service delivery is, we're in the private market, and it's almost like there's this iceberg. But beneath the iceberg, there's all of this rich private market information that's just stuck in people's minds. And if you don't know where to look and who to trust, you can kind of just, wandering around forever. But that's essentially what we try to find. We try to like unlock the information that's in that silo. Recently Kaliza was thinking about doing some customer development in a new geo. We put them in touch with a founder who had done that very similarly, very, very recently, right? Who they were able to exchange with. And so, I don't know, I think it's that type of stuff. We want to be your peripheral vision, and we want to kind of just like eliminate the noise and put you in touch with the people who have that institutional knowledge, either from a functional standpoint, as in like they've built this before, very recently, and you can shortcut your process by learning from them, or they have these very specific relationships that could be useful to you. And so I think we're continuing to improve on that. But I think I would just, as a founder, like tactically, like just ask your investors, like, really ask them, make sure that whoever you're working with is actually thinking about your business outside of work hours, is trying to get as much context as they can about what you're building so that you don't have to repeat yourself and you all can go in more depth. They should be going to conferences and, trying to be your outsourced scout or SDR, right? And so I think there are many opportunities for us as investors to improve on that value add. And I think ultimately all the value is driven by the founder and the team. We're just trying to put a little bit of turbo accelerant on it and to redirect when necessary.
And Ezra, so curious for you and for any founders listening who are maybe, a step or two behind you, what advice or feedback could you give a founder who's maybe, gearing up for their pre-seed or seed round that you would give, or maybe advice you'd give to your younger self while you were at that stage that you've learned?
I think it is a rather systematic process, and there's a science to it, right? As much as I talked about building rapport and relationships, like if you're about to get into running a process, like if you will, right, with investors, you have to know who's on your hit list, and you have to build that list out and really segment them and think about, do they what is your core industry, right? And then perhaps that as a field, and check off whether these investors actively invest in that space. Are they lead investor? Are they there's several ways to segment them, but I think those are some of the highlights to really pay attention to, because at the end of the day, you can just talk to there are tons of founders out there, but there are also tons of investors out there, right? And so I think it's important to have focus and make sure that you are kind of tracking these conversations. You understand how each of them run their own process. As we mentioned, like you may speak to an analyst or associate first, and that may lead to them looping in other colleagues, and then a partner, and then an investor committee. Like really be direct and ask, like, how do they go through their decision making, right? What are the ways that they get to a no or to a yes? What are their typical check sizes? Like, you should be information gathering, but also creating your dream list of investors you want to get in front of. And I think if you're rather systematic about it, it'll lead to a better process. And I'm fortunate that I had angels who coached me on this. Going back to the point of the role of angels in the first round, they want to see you do well, and some of them have been raised for their companies in the past, can help with that.
Awesome. Steph, would love to ask you the same question as well. I know you've been through this process, so if there's anything that you've learned throughout this process, or any feedback for any founders who are gearing up for a pre-seed, would love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, no, I think Ezra's advice is spot on. It's funny how the process itself is, I think, systematic, and you can be good at that and run a great process that can make the difference. And then I'd also add, which kind of sounds contradictory, but isn't, but I'd argue also, like, especially at the earliest stage, like really storytelling and vision, I think is underrated. People talk about traction and all that stuff. And I think obviously that's really important for the longevity of the business. I'd say arguably more important for future raises too. But I think sometimes in my experience, folks way overemphasize that at the seed and pre-seed, while undermining and not selling kind of like the bigger picture of the future vision that you're excited about the most. So that's the only thing I would add.
That is critical too. Ashley, that is the most critical thing you do as a founder.
100%.
The storytelling. It's like how you win investors, customers, team members, everyone. Yeah, completely agree with that.
Awesome. Fantastic, guys. Well, as we're wrapping up, Ezra, if someone is an interested investor or user or anyone who just wants to get in contact with you and learn about Kaliza and more about what you guys are doing, what's the best way for them to get in contact with you or reach out to you?
Yeah, I'd say give me a shout. I might be a little old school, but give me a shout on either email, LinkedIn. I'm Ezra@Kaliza.com, or LinkedIn. Give me a shout. You can ping me on Twitter. I should pay more attention to my Twitter inbox, but I'm just being candid about where I'll be more responsive. So all game for that.
Love it. And Abdul, same question. If there's a founder out there who thinks they might be a fit for Initialize, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
DM's open. I'm on Twitter.
Are you?
I am, yeah.
Are you? Good to know.
A little bit of a lurker, but
good to know you're
my
checking.
handle is Lee Musing, LYMUSING. I'm on LinkedIn, Abdul Lee, and I'm also at Abdul@Initialize.com. So excited to hear from folks.
Awesome. Well, this has been super fun, guys. Really appreciate the time and learning about both of you guys' experience and background. And again, really appreciate it. This has been awesome.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Steph. Thank you, Ezra.
That's a wrap for this episode of Inside the Deal. We hope you learned more about how these rounds really come together.
You're also invited to check out PIN, the easiest way to invest in startups with your community, whether you're accredited or not. Learn more about us at getpin.xyz.
If you enjoyed this episode and are looking for more venture content, make sure to check us out at sandhillmarkets.com. We run a weekly newsletter, live events, investor syndicate, and other great podcasts like this. Thanks for tuning in.